Hey everyone, welcome to our 12th and final presentation of Guilford at 250. This series has been made available through Preservation Greensboro Incorporated as an acknowledgement and recognition of the 250 years of history that Guilford County has experienced over the past 12 months. We have looked at various themes of architecture and community. We have talked about African American history here. We've talked about different communities in Guilford County. We've talked about the impact of women on the built environment. We've looked at modern architecture into the 20th century. And in our final presentation, I've been asked by staff to lighten it up a little bit and to make a presentation based on our superlatives. So what are our oldest sites in Guilford County, and how can we better understand what those are and their history? So that is what we're looking at today, is a review of historic sites and how old are some of our oldest sites of different varieties. So that is what we're going to talk about. But to start with, we really need to acknowledge, if we're going to talk about superlatives and if we're going to talk about the firsts in Guilford County, the first people that lived in Guilford County, of course, the native people included the Eno, the Kiowa, the Saponi, the Saura, the Shakori, the Sissepaw, and the Tutelo people. These were Siouan Native Americans who lived in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And the Piedmont at the time that they would have lived here kind of looked like this image. Native peoples often used fire to clean out the forest and to create grazing areas that would attract game. Deer and buffalo here in the Piedmont make for excellent hunting grounds. And so we need to acknowledge that if we're going to talk about the first, that the native peoples really were the first. We have very little remaining of that era of time. We have some roads that we'll talk about. We have some river names like the Haw River and the Uwharrie River. The Haw River starting in Guilford County in the western portion near the Forsyth County border, and the Uwharrie River starting in southern High Point and flowing south into the Yadkin River. So we do have some precious few names, but we just don't know a lot about these people. When Quakers first came to this area, they created a subcommittee to try to determine who to purchase this land from. And by the time the Quakers began to settle in this area in the 1750s, the native peoples were really decimated by European diseases, the smallpox and others. And there was not a lot of individuals around. There were not a lot of individuals around in which to consult to acquire property. So the Quakers put that committee down and gave up trying to find anyone to buy the land from. So today we acknowledge this point of our history. But if we're going to look at other superlatives here in our community, then we really should look at our oldest house. So how old is our oldest house? To look at that, there are different filters that we can determine our oldest house. If we were to be academics, we would look at the Haley House, built for Phoebe and John Haley in 1786. We know that because there is a date stone in the chimney high up. It's a circular stone that you can barely see in this photograph, way up near the chimney. And it has 1786 inscribed in that stone. So this building, which stands in High Point on the grounds of the High Point Historical Museum, is the oldest documented structure on its original foundations in Guilford County, 1786. So if you're going to be strict about definitions of dating, then this would be a candidate for the oldest house in Guilford County. However, Haley House is no longer a house. It is a museum. So if you would like to measure our oldest house in terms of a house that still is occupied as a house and still used today in its original for its original purpose, then we would need to shift to the Phoebe and Isaac Beeson house. This house was likely built in 1787, 1 year later than the Haley house. It stands in the Deep River Valley in far western Guilford County, just south of Colfax and what is now a portion of the growing boundaries of northern High Point. So this two-story brick house, both the Beeson house and the Haley house before it were built by Quakers. Quakers were quick to build with brick. They wanted sturdy structures that were going to last through time for the benefit of their families and future generations. So they built substantial houses. And so we have a wonderful body of brick homes here in Guilford County. It's a bit unusual. You don't find that in other parts of the state, these wonderful brick houses. So the Beeson house, 1787. However, there are other candidates as well. The McNary house is thought to have been built in 1761. It now stands on the grounds of the Greensboro History Museum. It was originally located in the northern part of the county. But for some purists out there, some academics, this house was moved. When it was moved, the original foundations were lost, the chimneys were lost. So some people would scratch their head and say, well, technically it's an old house, but it really has been substantially altered because of the move. The move was done in order to save it. You could also look at the Charles Bland house, known today as Blandwood, thought to have been built in 1795. Again, purists would say, well, we really haven't any substantial documentation to know exactly when that house was built. It does stand on its original foundations, which ironically are in downtown Greensboro. Blandwood is older than the city around it. In this foggy picture, you don't see the skyline of the city looming over Blandwood like you do on a sunny day. So both of these houses are early examples of domestic architecture. The earliest house that we know of would have been the McLean house. McLean house was in eastern Guilford County, pretty well documented to 1767. However, this building, as you can see, was in terrible disrepair by the 1960s, and it was carefully disassembled, and it was reconstructed on the interior of MESDA, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, in Old Salem. And you can visit this the main room of this house today by visiting MESDA, but it no longer stands in Greensboro or Guilford County. Had it stood, it would have been the oldest house documented in the county. So moving on, so we talked about some of our oldest houses. What about our oldest church? A lot of the communities that moved into Guilford County were religious communities. So what remains of their legacy? Well, the earliest church, a great candidate for the earliest church, would actually be a meeting house. This was the home of Jamestown Meeting House. It's in the town of Jamestown, but it's actually part of the city of High Point, City Lake Park. The building was built about 1819, and it was called an indulged meeting. And it was an indulgence because the Mendenhall family, who lived nearby, built it as like a little satellite meeting house. So if it was winter and the roads were really bad, or it was snowy or cold, and transportation was hard for the family to get to their home meeting, which was Deep River Meeting in North High Point, the indulgence was that they could meet in this little satellite meeting house in Jamestown. So it wasn't used all the time, but it was constructed in 1819. It stands today as the oldest Quaker meeting house in the state of North Carolina, and it certainly qualifies to be the oldest church in our county. But there are other caveats as well. Buffalo Presbyterian Church also had a brick structure that was built just a few years later, 1827, a substantial two-story brick building. I included the picture, a black and white picture is what the meeting house looked like before additions were made in the 1920s. And the color picture, of course, is what it looks like today. But if you look closely, look at the two doors on the front with the big window in the middle and the three windows across the top, you can see that is the same building. some of the architectural details have remained. So the Presbyterians were one of the early settlers here in Guilford County that date back to the 18th century. So this would certainly qualify. And then lastly, we have the brick church. Brick church was part of the German Reformed community. So right off the top, we have Quakers, Presbyterians, and German Reformed settlers also evolved into Lutheran faith as well. These were the three primary religious groups that settled early Guilford County. The footnote on this one is that the original brick church, it was so unusual at that time to have a substantial brick building that the site and the building itself was known as the brick church, because there weren't that many in that part of the county or anywhere in the Piedmont, really. So brick church was built in 1813, but apparently the brick was not of a good quality. And by 1840, it had to be carefully disassembled and rebuilt. So technically, that building dates from 1840, although some of the timbers on the inside of the building and some of the structural members have been studied through dendrochronology, in which the logs and timber are dated using counting their growth rings and examining their growth rings. Some of those timbers do date back to the 1813 construction period. So another candidate for being the oldest church. And then I also wanted to include Wadsworth Congregational Church, which has a fascinating history you can read about in our blog and some of our social media. We try to put information out about this, but this was an African-American church. It was built at the height of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was an incredibly important period in American history, here in Guilford County, as African-American communities began to develop agency and to control their future. And the church was really a way that the African-American community was able to organize itself socially, politically, and guard its interests. And this early church building in eastern Guilford County was built in 1885. It stands as likely the earliest example of African-American church architecture, and I think it's just a splendid, beautiful country church, and I love its architecture. I love the pointy windows on the ground floor. So we've talked about houses, we've talked about churches. Now, how about industry? We're known here in the Piedmont of North Carolina for our industry. We had a valuable asset in the Piedmont that the eastern part of the state didn't have, and that is the fall and the height of rivers. And as rivers cross the hilly Piedmont, they descend in elevation, and that the fall in elevation creates sort of waterfalls and opportunities for water power to be used. So a lot of our earliest industrial sites here are built along streams. Here we have Bales Mill, known today as the Old Mill at Guilford, built on the Beaver Creek in the Oak Ridge community in northwestern part of Guilford County in 1822. It stands as one of the oldest continually operating grist mills in the nation. If you have not taken the drive out NC 68 and gone to visit this mill, they still grind flour, wheat, cornmeal, wonderful pancake mix, and you can walk into this. It still operates. You get the smell of the flour. You can go in and buy some of these wonderful mixes, and you can eat Guilford County. So we've got a wonderful asset here that other counties don't have in the Piedmont of North Carolina, and a very original and still operating grist mill. 1822 probably stands as the oldest example of industrial architecture. But we have other sites too. Here on the Deep River near central Jamestown is what was known as the Robbins Holton Mill, built in 1825, right after the old mill at Guilford. It still stands today, but it's not in very good shape. It's, as you see in the picture, the lower floor has been destroyed by some floods. So it still stands, but hopefully somebody one day will be able to make an investment and save this wonderful building. It is a very important grist mill, made ground flour here, and but it is threatened, but it stands today in Jamestown as one of our oldest sites of industry. And don't forget that the Guilford County was the center of gold mining. 1799 is when a very large gold nugget was found in Charlotte, and people were able to discover that there was a gold vein that extended from Charlotte just south of Concord and south of Salisbury, and came almost up to Greensboro. The closest mine to Greensboro was about where Grandover is today, the Grandover Golf Resort. And that was about as far as the gold mining got. There were a few other sites in South Guilford County, also copper mines. But the McCullough Gold Mill was built in 1832. It's a substantial stone building. It has one of the earliest examples of a Gothic arch. See the archway over the entry, looks like a castle. It has a drawbridge, and that drawbridge literally was constructed in order to make this a fortified building, because obviously if you're mining gold, if you're milling milk quartz, which is a native rock here in Guilford County, and grinding that into sand and then using mercury to extract the gold, then you've got a lot of gold in this little fortified castle. And McCullough knew that. He was an Englishman. He was from Cornwall. This building closely resembles some of the tin mines that you see in the Cornwall section, in the Shire south, most southwest in England. And so this is a little bit of English architecture and a touchstone to our gold mining interests. 1832, very, very early example of industrial architecture for the Piedmont of North Carolina, really anywhere in the South. And it's here in Guilford. How about our oldest store? Talking about commercial properties, what would our oldest store? We had a lot of country stores dating all the way back to the earliest settlement in the mid 18th century. But one building stands near Whitsett. That is the Alamance Post Office, and you might recognize that Alamance is spelled wrong. Now, this is the old way of spelling Alamance. The little building survived near the Sedalia community, but it was constructed about 1799, and it was moved by a great preservationist in Guilford County, Jerry Nix, to his home property, and was totally restored in its little postal museum at this time. So 1799, pretty remarkably old for Guilford County. But there are other examples other than the Alamance Post Office. In Jamestown, we keep coming back to Jamestown, but across from the Mendenhall Home Place in the City Lake Park, very close to that Quaker Indulged Meeting House, built in 1824, is the Mendenhall Store. This was a commercial building that Richard Mendenhall built. He crafted things in leather, and he built this building to sell his wares. And probably originally when it was built, it was meant that this house would be the first of a series of buildings that would sort of continue off to the right of the building. So you'd sort of see a series of these buildings sort of lined up in different sizes and materials. And it would have been like a sort of an old English village in a way. But this building is a remarkable survivor, has survived storms, wars, earthquakes, and it looks incredibly handsome today, and is cared for and owned by the city of High Point. We have another runner-up. This would be the Hillsdale Store. Now, footnote on this building, the Hillsdale Store, which is located in downtown Hillsdale, which is a crossroads in northern Guilford County, just north of Greensboro, was originally built as the Hillsdale Female Academy in 1855. It was built by a fellow named Archibald Bevel. And he built this little female academy to benefit his daughters so that they could have an education. When the daughters grew up, there was no more need for a female school since his daughters were educated. And by 1860, there are references in the newspaper of the Hillsdale Store. So it was a female academy only 5 years. So it remains a commercial building today in the Hillsdale community, but it was used very early in its history by 1860, 5 years after it was built, as a commercial building. So we'll count it as well. Education has always been very important in Guilford County. The Quakers, these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, all valued their children getting education. So we do have some early examples of school buildings here in Guilford. The earliest, coming back to Jamestown, the Mendenhall Home Place, stands a one-room schoolhouse that was built about 1825. It was likely built for the Richard Mendenhall family and neighborhood children to attend schools. It might have also been used to teach enslaved people. Quakers did not believe that slavery was morally correct, and so they would openly educate young Black students and until it really became against the law, and then they had to do it illegally in secret. So this might have contained some classroom space for both white and Black children here in Guilford County through the Quakers. We have two early examples of schools that were more public in nature. The Pinedale School in eastern Guilford County is a little country schoolhouse. It would have had one primary room with those big windows that would have let lots of light, and it even had a little belfry that you literally had a bell that the teacher would call students to school, to class, by ringing the bell in the little belfry. It was built about 1909 to 1910 using public money, and it's a rare surviving example of early Guilford County schools during a time of educational expansion and reform. It's now used as a residence. And then I also included the East White Oak School. Though this was not a public school, it was built for the employees of the cone mills in northeastern Guilford County, and specifically children who lived in the East White Oak community who were African American. So this school built using cone money, so it's sort of like a corporate school, built in 1916, and as into the middle of the 20th century, the school was taken over by Guilford County Schools and Greensboro City Schools, and they eventually closed it. It was turned into a YMCA for a period of time, and then was preserved as a museum in 1956, I believe, which is a good 10 years before Preservation Greensboro was established. And it has been really a community center and museum ever since. And it's a wonderful site that is getting some much needed restoration at this time in the East White Oak community of Northeast Greensboro. The oldest school building that still survives in Guilford County that's still used for educational purposes is likely to be Archdale Hall. This is one of the buildings on the Guilford College campus. It dated to 1885, so that's pretty decently old. And it has gone through a number of renovations. The last has been in the past 10 to 15 years, and it was quite respectful of the original fabric that was remaining inside the building, but it kind of has this Victorian theme with the high pointy arched roofs, the gables along the front, and a lot of chimneys, because this was before forced air and heating systems, HVAC systems. So a lot of fireplaces in this old building, and you see all the 6 chimneys poking up above the roof line on the Archdale Hall, which is on the campus again at Guilford College. How about our oldest park in Guilford County? When we talk about our earliest park, we're talking about recreation space, open space that's owned by the community and maintained for public interest. Certainly the winner on this one for the oldest park would be Guilford Courthouse Battleground. This site was acquired in 1886. There were concerns at the time that that right after the American centennial of the Revolutionary War, which was, of course, centennial was in 1876, and years after that, there was concern that we were not able to preserve and respect our military history. And so members of the Schenck family were able to acquire this land through an organization called Guilford Battleground Company, and acquired this property as early as 1886 in order to preserve it. These monuments, stone monuments, were placed on the grounds to commemorate different people, different initiatives, and it was handed over to the federal government in 1917 and as a national military park. And today it remains a national military park, and people are able to use the park space for recreation or just sort of enjoying the great outdoors. But 1886, that's pretty early for North Carolina to have a park. If you're looking at more of like a traditional urban park, Fisher Park might be that candidate for one of the earlier parks. 1901 is when Captain Basil J. Fisher, who was an Englishman, came to Greensboro, acquired land north of the center city, and dedicated that open space along a stream to be park space. And he made an agreement with the city of Greensboro and said, "Here's the deal: I will donate this land for a park, but the city has to create a carriage path or roadway around and circling the park." And so the city aldermen sort of reviewed the opportunity, and they agreed to take on the park, and they agreed to build the road around it. So in this picture, you can see the road. You can see a car parked in the right-hand side, waiting at a stop sign. You can see the First Presbyterian Church looming over the park. It was more of a passive park at the time, although there were different dance halls that were built in the second decade of the 20th century. But today it's really been returned back to a passive park with pathways and where people can jog, or they can have a picnic and enjoy yoga in the garden or whatever you'd like to do. So it remains a very cherished park, very close to downtown Greensboro in the Fisher Park neighborhood. One other category of interest people have asked is how old is our oldest road? Well, of course, Guilford County has had roads all the way back to the first people. First people migrated from this area down to trade to other communities, and roads often were arranged along ridge lines, because the ridge lines are kind of interconnected around the streams, and they create an easy path of movement without having to get your feet wet and cross a river. So ridge lines quickly became sort of like little highways at the time, with footpaths along the ridge lines. So this is the earliest road map that we have just of Guilford County. It shows the arrangement of roads in 1895. And I'm going to zoom into the southeastern portion of the county for the next image. And the outlined in red is likely the oldest primary road through the Piedmont, really altogether. It was the Great Trading Path. It connected Hillsborough and Petersburg and areas of the Piedmont of Virginia south to Salisbury, the Catawba Nation outside of Charlotte, and on to the southwest. So this was an important trading path for the first people. It was an important trading path for Europeans as well. It was called the Okanichi Path by some very early on. It's still, the path is still used as a roadway today. If you look at a map and see NC 62, as it goes from Julian northeastward towards Burlington, you can drive along this. And if you look in the woods in the wintertime along the sides of the road, you'll see little worn ruts that indicate deviations from this original path that still exists today. We have another very early road, the Cape Fear Road, which connected the mountains to the sea by following one of these ridge lines. The Cape Fear Road really marks the boundary from the Haw River and the Cape Fear River to the east, to the Yadkin River and the PD River to the west. So today it roughly parallels Main Street in High Point. So if you drop a glass of water west of that red line in High Point, it drains down into Abbott's Creek, or the Uwharrie River ends up in the Yadkin, and the PD River in Georgetown in South Carolina. If you drop a glass of water anywhere in the county to the east of that red line, it's going to flow down the Haw River into the Cape Fear, go by Fayetteville, and end up in the Atlantic at Wilmington. So that red line was a road that went all the way down to the coastline, and it would have provided a way to not have to cross any streams or rivers on your path from the mountains to the sea. And lastly, European settlers would have likely created the Hillsborough to Salem Road. By virtue of its name, you can imagine that it did not exist before the towns of Hillsborough or Salem were founded in the 1750s. But this would have become an important sort of stage road or path through the woods that connected the two Piedmont towns. And through time, it grew into US 70 to the east of Greensboro, To the west, it was 421, goes through the Friendship area, goes towards Kernersville in the west, and Salem and Burlington in the east. And today it really is paralleled by Interstate 40. So Interstate 40 sort of carries the traffic that the movement that would have gone between east and west through this upper northern part of North Carolina's Piedmont. And of course, our earliest railroad is a decently early one, not the earliest in the state, but early by any measure across the United States. And that's the Great North Carolina Railroad that connected Goldsboro and Morehead City along the coast to Charlotte in the west. It originally was to across the state from Raleigh directly to Salisbury to Charlotte. But there was a fellow who lived in Greensboro by the name of Governor John Motley Morehead, who wanted the railroad to touch his property called Blandwood. And he had great power at the time. He wanted Greensboro to prosper. So he had the railroad moved. And instead of crossing through the Piedmont through Asheboro, which was an older city than Greensboro, he had it moved to cross through Greensboro. So Greensboro is maybe what Asheboro would have been had the railroad crossed to the south, and Asheboro is what Greensboro would have been had it not been relocated by Morehead. But because of Morehead, this main trunk railroad, he called it the Tree of Life for North Carolina because it facilitated industry and manufacturing across the Piedmont. And the towns of Burlington and High Point were born of this railroad, this red line that crosses North Carolina. In fact, the Piedmont Crescent, the sort of urbanized area today that goes from Charlotte through Salisbury, High Point, Greensboro, Burlington, Durham, Raleigh, was really born by the railroad and some of these early paths that we've talked about. So I hope that you have a greater appreciation of some of our earliest sites and earliest achievements, all the way from the first people who lived here. We have an incredible history of early buildings, maybe a little earlier than you thought. Sometimes people are surprised here in Guilford County that we have buildings that date back to the 1700s and that we still have operating grist mills and buildings that are used as still for educational purposes and commercial purposes that were built in the 1800s. It is somewhat remarkable, but it is testimony to the deep history that Guilford County enjoys. That we celebrate in 2021, 250 years. So I hope that you've enjoyed that. We've enjoyed presenting this Guilford at 250. We will try to have some more Zoom conversations and more presentations in our YouTube library in the future. But I hope that you stand a little more proud if you're from Guilford County. We've got a great, rich history here that we need to preserve. So thank you for your attention and make it a great day. Thanks.